My dad fell at work and was taken to the hospital. I drove there that night, but due to living a 9-hour drive away, I didn't get there until late. At that time, it was as you'd imagine it to be. Yellow-lit hallways and an uncomfortable silence to the place. I explained the situation to the receptionist, and he told me that given the time, I couldn't go and visit my dad, but when possible, he'd send the doctor over to update me. I thanked him, got some water out of the fountain, and went over to the waiting area. There were a couple of other people there. A woman of about 40 who was reading a book. A man in scruffy clothes who was sleeping across 3 seats and using his backpack as a pillow. It had been a long drive, and although I tried my best to keep my eyes open, the tiredness won out and I fell asleep. I had this weird dream that I was tied to a cot and about a dozen people in doctor's coats were staring down at me. In their hands, they were all holding different implements, tweezers, a scalpel, and needles. Suddenly, one of the doctors started coughing, this loud, frenzied cough. I woke up sweaty and panicked and saw that standing over me was that scruffy man. He was literally just there, hovering over me with this creepy look on his face. In my groggy, freaked-out state of mind, I managed to ask him what he wanted, but he just continued standing there and staring at me. In the end, I shuffled along the seats until I was far enough away from him. His eyes followed me as I moved, and he just stayed like that, staring at me. I felt so uncomfortable that I considered going back to my car and sleeping there until morning visiting hours. As I thought about this, the man let out a croaky laugh and then took small, shuffled steps back toward his backpack, flung the strap over his shoulder, and left. It was a relief knowing the creepy man had gone, but I still felt too on edge to be able to fall back to sleep. About 10 minutes after the man had left, the woman sitting opposite me who'd been reading the book earlier looked at me and pointed at my jacket pocket. My first thoughts were that she was crazy too, and I felt myself begin to panic. Still, I found myself peering down and saw that there was a red dot stuck to it. I peeled it off and looked back at the woman. She nervously checked the waiting area before she came and sat down next to me, and in a whispered voice, told me that she'd watched that man stick it on my pocket before he started staring at me. She told me that she'd coughed to try to wake me up and that she was sorry for not doing more sooner, but she was scared. I nodded at her and thanked her for her help. She nodded back and then went back to her seat. I don't know. From the glazed look in her eyes, I just feel like there was something she wasn't telling me. After that, I bought an energy drink from the vending machine to stay awake. No way was I going to risk falling asleep if that creepy man decided to come back. The doctor came to see me soon after that, and when I returned to the waiting area, the woman had gone and new people were sitting there. Still to this day, the whole thing gives me this nagging, anxious feeling. I'll never know what that man wanted with me, or what the meaning behind the red dot was. I guess I'll never know. Thankfully, my dad hasn't had any more falls, so I haven't had to go back there since. My fear of hospitals stemmed from when I was 10 years old and had to go there once to visit my grandma. I remember the long, spotlessly white corridors, my echoing footsteps on the sheet vinyl floor, and how the disinfectant smell tickled the inside of my nose. My grandma had seemed so small and frail beneath the crisp white bed sheets. At first, I didn't know what to say to her, but then I began to relax and tell her about school. My mom stepped out of the room to talk to the doctor, and as I spoke to my grandma, I noticed she looked past me and out the window. I saw the terror in her eyes and turned to see what she'd seen. Standing outside of the window was a pretty woman dressed in all black. She was just standing there, staring at my grandma with this curled smile and these dark eyes. My grandma started shaking and screaming out that she didn't want to be taken. I got so upset that my mom had to take me out of there. My grandma passed away that night, and I'd tried my best to avoid stepping in a hospital ever since. The trouble is, the things you try to avoid tend to catch up with you eventually. So when my dad called, saying my brother had been in a car accident and was in the hospital, I just knew that this was it. I'd have to face my fears and go back there. My dad was there waiting for me at the hospital. He led me inside and explained that my brother was currently sleeping, but his condition was stable. He led me into his room, and seeing my brother there connected to those tubes and that beeping machine was horrible. I sat next to my brother and held his hand. I wanted to be there to support him, but just being in that hospital made me feel anxious. I nervously kept staring out at the hallway and through the window. I eventually began to calm down, and thankfully, my brother regained consciousness. I noticed that my brother wasn't looking at me, but instead, he was focusing on something directly behind me, and he had this fearful look in his eyes. He fell back to sleep shortly after that, and I attributed it to the meds he was on. After about an hour, my dad told me to go home and get some rest, and as I knew my brother was okay, I agreed. I left the room and was almost at the end of the hallway when I realized I'd left my purse in his room. I hurried back to the room, but as I stepped inside, I froze in terror. There, looming over my brother, was a pretty woman dressed in black. She looked up from my brother, and as her dark eyes landed on me, her mouth curled into a smile. I felt my chest tighten and my mind blur. In that moment, I just needed to get out of there. I scrambled along the hallway, calling for help. A nurse ran past me and went into the room. When she reappeared, she insisted there was no woman in there and that my brother was fine. I knew she didn't believe me, but I knew what I'd seen. I waited until my brother was discharged from the hospital and back with my parents before I visited him again. I stayed there over the weekend, and he walked in on me as I was sitting outside sketching that woman in black. On seeing her lips, he trembled, and there was this look of fear in his eyes. I knew at that moment that he recognized her. He'd seen her too. I don't know who that woman is or what seeing her means. I just know in my gut that my brother is lucky to still be alive. During my final semester in nursing school, I was assigned to do clinicals at this one hospital that seemed to be off the grid. It was miles from the nearest town, and I found this kind of strange. It wasn't long after working there that I learned it was reserved for the super wealthy and elite. Due to this, it was usual to only have a couple of patients assigned to us at a time. It was every nurse's dream. Whenever I was on shift, I always felt like the visitors were staring at me and critiquing my every move. I tried to be as attentive as I could be to my patients, but having their relatives always look at me in that dismissive way made me feel uncomfortable. As a professional, I tried to put my feelings aside and put my focus on my patients. Then, during the middle of a night shift, this one elderly lady named Ivy arrived. She wasn't an emergency, so her coming in at this hour seemed unusual. Her son brought her in. He was wearing an expensive-looking black suit, and as he spoke to the doctor, I felt his gaze fall on me. A few moments later, the charge nurse informed me that I would be Ivy's nurse for the rest of my shift that night. As I said, Ivy wasn't injured or sick or anything. She just seemed a little confused. I made sure she was comfortable and poured her some water. As I placed the cup to her lips, she took my hand and, in a shaky voice, said, "Daniel said you'd be here. He said your donation will save me." Not knowing what else to do, I just nodded and smiled at her. Her chart didn't mention she had dementia, but she was an elderly lady who was in an unfamiliar place, so her confusion was understandable. When I left the room, I couldn't see her son anywhere, so I figured he'd left without saying goodbye to his mom. I continued with my rounds, checking on my other patient and organizing the doctor's notes. Remembering something I needed to check, I carried out my next round slightly earlier than usual. As expected, all the patients were asleep, but then I reached Ivy's room and saw her sitting on the side of her bed with her back to me. I walked over to her and gently asked if she was okay, if she needed anything. When she didn't reply, I placed my hand on her shoulder. She immediately gripped my hand and spun to face me. I noticed how alert her eyes were, and she tightly squeezed my hand and frantically said, "Is it time yet? I think it's time. Don't worry, darling. Daniel says you'll only feel a pinch." I felt my heart pounding, but she was an old lady, and I didn't want to cause her any more distress. So I managed to wiggle my hand free, forced a smile, and calmly told her that it was late and she should get some sleep. I managed to calm her down and get her into bed, but as I left her, she was still mumbling under her breath about it being the right time. My hand was red from where she'd held me, and I had an uneasy feeling about the whole thing, so I went to find the doctor to get his opinion. As I walked along the hallway, I saw the doctor disappearing into a room, but he wasn't alone. Ivy's son was with him. I don't normally eavesdrop on people, but on this occasion, every ounce of me urged me to listen in. So I stood outside the door. I heard Ivy's son saying it was the right time. Then the doctor replied saying he was confident about the procedure. Then they said something else that gave me the chills. They said my name. On hearing their footsteps, I hid behind the closest door, peeked through it, and watched as both men walked out. The doctor was holding a syringe in his gloved hand. They walked toward the unit that I was supposed to be on. I stayed there in that patient's room as they stormed back along the hallway and searched every room. I hid under the sleeping patient's bed, and my heart pounded as the door creaked open. I heard footsteps nearing me and saw a pair of sturdy black boots. I've never been so relieved in my life as when they finally turned and left. I managed to run along the hallway without being seen and escaped the hospital. When I got home, I called my supervisor and left her a message explaining why I'd left and told her that something was wrong. The next day, I was reinstated at the last hospital I worked for. No questions asked. Apparently, that hospital closed down a few weeks after that happened to me. At least, that's what I heard. Just thinking about that night and what could have happened to me if I'd been in Ivy's room when I was meant to be gives me the creeps. I don't know what that doctor and that man had planned for me. All I do know is that I'm certain that that syringe wasn't meant for any of the patients. It was meant for me.